The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg training facility as Admiral Sarah Chun stepped out of her civilian Honda Accord. She wore simple jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and worn sneakers, nothing that would indicate her true rank or position. Today was supposed to be a routine inspection of the new joint training program, but she had specifically requested to observe without the usual fanfare that accompanied high-ranking officials. Sarah had worked too hard to get where she was to let ceremony get in the way of real assessment. At 38, she was the youngest person ever to achieve the rank of Admiral in the Navy SEALs, and the first woman to hold the position. Her path had been filled with skeptics, doubters, and those who believed she had somehow taken shortcuts. The truth was quite the opposite. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else, completed every mission flawlessly, and earned respect through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. The joint training facility buzzed with activity as various military units conducted exercises. Marines, Army Rangers, Navy personnel, and Air Force Special Operations teams all work side by side in this new initiative designed to improve inter-service cooperation. The program was Sarah's brainchild, developed after years of witnessing communication breakdowns and territorial disputes that cost lives in real combat situations. She walked through the main gate, her visitor's badge clearly displayed, though the young security guard barely glanced at it. To him, she was just another civilian contractor or family member visiting the base. Sarah preferred it this way. It allowed her to see things as they really were, not as they appeared when everyone was on their best behavior for visiting brass. The first training area she approached was the Urban Warfare Simulation Zone. Concrete buildings designed to mimic Middle Eastern architecture rose from the red clay ground, complete with narrow alleys, rooftops, and hidden sniper positions. The exercise in progress involved a mixed team of Army Rangers and Navy SEALs working together to clear a building of hostile forces. Sarah positioned herself behind a concrete barrier where several other observers stood. Most were instructors taking notes, but a few appeared to be visiting personnel from other units. She pulled out a small notebook, the same kind she had carried through every mission during her active combat days, and began documenting what she saw. The team moved with precision through the lower floors of the target building. Communication was crisp, hand signals were properly executed, and the soldiers demonstrated excellent tactical awareness. Sarah smiled slightly as she watched the seamless integration between the different service branches. This was exactly what she had envisioned when she proposed the program. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez led the Army Ranger contingent with confidence. He was a 10-year veteran with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for being tough but fair with new soldiers. Marcus took pride in maintaining the Rangers' elite status and sometimes struggled with the idea that other units could perform at the same level. Today's exercise was his chance to show that Rangers could outperform the Navy SEALs, even on their home turf. The SEAL team was led by Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh, a skilled operator who had proven herself in countless missions. She understood the importance of this joint training program and was committed to making it work, despite resistance from some of her subordinates who preferred working exclusively with other SEALs. Sarah watched as both teams coordinated their movements up the building stairwells. The exercise scenario required them to clear each floor while searching for high-value targets and avoiding civilian casualties represented by cardboard cutouts placed throughout the structure. Points were awarded for speed, accuracy, and proper procedure, while points were deducted for friendly fire incidents or civilian casualties. The afternoon heat was beginning to build, and Sarah could see sweat starting to show through the soldiers' uniforms. She remembered countless training days like this from her own career, when the combination of adrenaline, physical exertion, and mental pressure created the perfect environment for both learning and mistakes. As the teams moved to the 3rd floor, Sarah noticed a problem developing. The Army Rangers were moving faster than planned, eager to finish the exercise quickly and demonstrate their superiority. Meanwhile, the SEALs were maintaining their methodical pace, prioritizing thoroughness over speed. This difference in approach was creating gaps in their coordination that a real enemy could exploit. Marcus keyed his radio, frustration evident in his voice. "SEAL team, you need to pick up the pace. We're leaving ourselves exposed with this slow movement." Lieutenant Commander Walsh responded calmly. "Ranger team, maintain protocol. Speed without precision gets people killed." Sarah made notes about this interaction. The tension between different unit cultures was exactly the kind of issue this training program was designed to address. In real combat situations, such disagreements could prove fatal. She had seen it happen before. Units working across purposes because they couldn't adapt their individual methodologies to work as a cohesive whole. The exercise continued with increasing tension between the two teams. Rangers prided themselves on rapid, overwhelming force, while SEALs favored careful planning and precise execution. Both approaches had their merits, but combining them required compromise that neither group seemed willing to make. As the teams reached the fourth floor, the exercise scenario introduced a complication. Intelligence reports indicated that hostiles had taken civilian hostages in one of the rooms. The team would need to identify the correct room, plan their entry carefully, and execute a rescue without casualties. This was exactly the kind of situation where inter-service cooperation was most critical. Sarah watched as Marcus and Jessica huddled with their respective teams to plan the assault. She could see the debate happening through their body language, animated gestures, pointing at building layouts, and occasional head shaking that indicated disagreement. After several minutes, they appeared to reach some kind of consensus. The plan they developed called for the Rangers to create a diversion on one side of the building while the SEALs executed the actual rescue. It was a sound strategy that played to each unit's strengths, but Sarah could already see potential problems in the execution. Marcus positioned his Rangers in the stairwell adjacent to the target room. Their job was to make enough noise to draw the attention of the hostile forces away from the actual entry point. Meanwhile, Jessica's SEALs moved into position outside the room where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the hostiles would have time to reposition. Too late, and the Rangers would be exposed unnecessarily. Sarah had participated in dozens of similar operations during her career, and she knew how easily such coordination could break down under pressure. At the predetermined signal, Marcus led his Rangers in creating their diversion. They moved loudly through the adjacent area, calling out commands and making enough noise to simulate a full assault. The sound echoed through the concrete building, masking the quiet movements of the SEAL team. Jessica's team moved like ghosts toward their target. Years of training had taught them to minimize noise, communicate through subtle gestures, and position themselves for maximum effectiveness. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching these sailors work. They represented the best of what the Navy SEALs could offer. The simulated hostage rescue began with explosive charges breaching the door. In a real situation, these would be actual explosives, but for training purposes, they used sound simulators that created realistic noise without structural damage. The SEALs flowed into the room like water, each member knowing exactly where to go and what to do. Within seconds, the exercise was over. All simulated hostiles had been neutralized, and all hostages were secure. It was a textbook operation that demonstrated the effectiveness of combining different unit capabilities. Sarah made notes about the successful coordination, but she also observed some of the tensions that remained between the teams. As the soldiers began to reset for the next exercise, Sarah noticed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approaching her observation position. His expression suggested he was not entirely pleased with something, though she couldn't tell what specific issue might be bothering him. Marcus had noticed the woman taking notes throughout the exercise. She appeared to be some kind of civilian observer, possibly a contractor or family member of one of the participants. What bothered him was her obvious scrutiny of his Ranger's performance. He had caught her writing extensively during moments when his team was moving, and her expression suggested she might be critical of what she was seeing. The idea that some civilian was sitting in judgment of professional soldiers irritated Marcus considerably. He had spent years earning his position and proving his worth in combat. The thought that someone with no military experience might be evaluating his team's performance struck him as presumptuous and inappropriate. Sarah was focused on her notes when she became aware of someone approaching. She looked up to see a muscular sergeant with ranger tabs on his uniform walking directly toward her. His body language suggested he was agitated about something, though she couldn't imagine what might have caused such a reaction. Marcus stopped a few feet away from Sarah and crossed his arms. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to move to a different observation area. This position is reserved for military personnel and authorized observers." Sarah looked up at him with surprise. She glanced down at her visitor's badge, which clearly indicated she had authorization to be in this area. When she looked back up at Marcus, she could see that he was serious about his request, despite the fact that she was following all posted regulations. "I have proper authorization to be here, Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly. "My badge indicates approval for this observation area." Marcus looked at the visitor's badge, but dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "That's a general access badge. This is a restricted training area, and I need to maintain security for my soldiers. Civilian contractors and family members need to observe from the designated areas further back." Sarah felt her eyebrows raise slightly. It had been years since someone had tried to order her around based on assumptions about her authority. Part of her was amused by the situation, but another part was genuinely curious to see how far this would go. She decided not to immediately correct his misunderstanding. "I'm not a family member, and I'm not a contractor," Sarah said evenly. "I'm here on official business to observe this training exercise." Marcus shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, I don't care what kind of business you think you have here. This is a live-fire exercise area, and I'm responsible for everyone's safety. You need to move to the civilian observation area immediately." Other soldiers had begun to notice the interaction. Some of the Navy SEALs were watching with obvious curiosity, while several Rangers had positioned themselves behind their sergeant in a show of support. Sarah realized that this situation was rapidly becoming a teaching moment, though not the kind anyone had planned. Lieutenant Commander Walsh approached from a SEAL's side, her expression showing concern about the developing confrontation. She had noticed the civilian observer earlier and assumed she was some kind of official evaluator, given her obvious familiarity with military procedures and her detailed note-taking. "Is there a problem here, Sergeant Rodriguez?" Jessica asked diplomatically. Marcus turned to include her in the conversation. "Ma'am, this civilian is in a restricted area during live exercises. I'm asking her to move to an appropriate observation position for safety reasons." Jessica looked at Sarah with renewed interest. Something about the woman's calm demeanor and comfortable presence in a military environment suggested there might be more to this situation than was immediately apparent. The way she held herself, the confidence in her responses, and her obvious understanding of military procedures all indicated someone with significant experience. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of the entire day. Instead of immediately revealing her identity and rank, she decided to see how far this misunderstanding would develop. It would provide valuable insight into how junior personnel behaved when they thought no one important was watching. "Sergeant, I understand your concern for safety," Sarah said, maintaining her calm tone. "However, I'm properly authorized to be in this position. Perhaps you should check with your commanding officer before ordering people to move." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The woman's response struck him as insubordinate, even though she technically wasn't under his command. Her suggestion that he needed to check with higher authority felt like a challenge to his competence and authority. "Ma'am, I'm the commanding officer for this exercise," Marcus replied with emphasis. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh and I are running this training operation, and I'm telling you that civilian personnel need to observe from designated areas. This isn't a debate." Jessica found herself in an awkward position. As the Navy representative, she didn't want to undermine her Army counterpart's authority, but Something about this situation felt wrong. The civilian woman's responses were too knowledgeable, too calm, and too confident for someone who was genuinely out of place. Sarah decided to push the situation a little further to see what would happen. Sergeant Rodriguez, what specific regulation are you citing that requires me to move? My authorization clearly permits me to observe from this location. The question caught Marcus off guard. He was acting on general principles of safety and security rather than any specific written regulation. His authority to control access to training areas was real, but he hadn't expected to be challenged on the specific legal basis for his orders. I don't need to cite regulations to maintain safety in my exercise area, Marcus replied, his voice rising slightly. I'm giving you a direct order to move to the civilian observation area. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security to escort you out. Several more soldiers had gathered to watch the confrontation. Word was beginning to spread through both units that their sergeant was having some kind of dispute with a civilian observer. Some thought Marcus was being unnecessarily harsh, while others supported his right to maintain control over his training area. Sarah looked around at the growing audience and realized that this situation had gone far enough. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was now becoming a serious confrontation that could have career implications for everyone involved. She also recognized that she had learned valuable information about how these units interacted under pressure. Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah said, reaching into her pocket. Before you call security, perhaps you should take a closer look at my identification. Marcus watched suspiciously as she pulled out a military ID card. He expected to see some kind of contractor identification or dependent card that would confirm his assumption about her civilian status. What he saw instead made his face go pale and his hand started to tremble. Marcus stared at the military ID card in Sarah's outstretched hand, his eyes struggling to process what he was seeing. The photograph clearly showed the same woman standing in front of him, but the rank insignia and information printed on the card seemed impossible. Admiral Sarah Chun, United States Navy SEALs. The ID declared an official lettering that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The color drained from Marcus's face as the full implications of the situation hit him. He had just spent the last 10 minutes ordering a Navy admiral to move from her authorized position, questioning her authority, and threatening to have her escorted off the base by security. The magnitude of his mistake was so enormous that he struggled to form coherent thoughts. Lieutenant Commander Walsh stepped closer to get a better look at the ID card, and her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to barely concealed panic. She had heard of Admiral Chun, of course. Every Navy SEAL knew about the first woman to achieve that rank in their community. Walsh had even seen photographs of the Admiral in official publications, but those images showed her in dress uniform with full military bearing, nothing like the casually dressed woman observing their training exercise. The crowd of soldiers that had gathered to watch the confrontation began to realize that something significant was happening. Those close enough to see the ID card started whispering to their companions, and within moments the word Admiral was rippling through both units like wildfire. Rangers and SEALs alike found themselves staring at the unassuming woman who had somehow become the center of a situation that would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. Sarah calmly returned her ID to her pocket and looked at Marcus with an expression that was neither angry nor amused, but simply observant. She had been in the military long enough to understand that mistakes happened, especially when people made assumptions based on appearances. The question now was how everyone would handle the aftermath of this misunderstanding. Marcus felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. His mind raced through the events of the last few minutes, each memory now carrying a weight that seemed impossible to bear. He had questioned an admiral's authority, ordered her to leave, threatened to call security, and done it all in front of dozens of witnesses from multiple military units. The potential consequences for his career were staggering. Admiral Chun, Marcus managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I apologize, ma'am. I had no idea who you were. I thought you were a civilian contractor, or... Sarah held up a hand to stop his stammering apology. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you thought you were doing your job. You saw someone you believed was out of place in a potentially dangerous area, and you acted to maintain safety and security. Those are commendable instincts, even if your execution was flawed. The crowd of soldiers remained silent, hanging on every word of the exchange. Many of them were trying to process their own reactions to discovering that they had been unknowingly performing in front of one of the highest-ranking officers in naval special warfare. Some felt pride at having demonstrated their skills before such distinguished observation, while others worried about any mistakes they might have made during the exercise. Lieutenant Commander Walsh felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the relatively cool morning air. As the senior Navy officer present, she should have recognized Admiral Chun, or at least suspected her identity based on her obvious familiarity with military procedures. The fact that she had stood by and watched while an Army sergeant ordered a Navy admiral to leave the area reflected poorly on her awareness and leadership. Sarah looked around at the assembled soldiers, taking note of their expressions and body language. She could see fear, embarrassment, curiosity, and respect in various faces. This was exactly the kind of unexpected situation that revealed character and tested leadership under pressure. The way everyone handled the next few minutes would tell her more about this joint training program than hours of formal observation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah continued, your mistake was not in trying to maintain security. Your mistake was in making assumptions based on appearances and then refusing to listen when those assumptions were challenged. A good leader gathers information before making decisions, especially when someone questions their authority with valid points. Marcus nodded miserably, understanding that he was receiving what might generously be called a learning opportunity rather than the career-ending reprimand he probably deserved. Yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right. I should have verified your authorization more carefully before ordering you to move. Sarah turned to address Lieutenant Commander Walsh. Commander, what's your assessment of this situation? Jessica felt her stomach tighten as she realized she was being tested. The Admiral wasn't just asking for her opinion. She was evaluating how the Navy's junior officers handled unexpected challenges and supported their joint service partners. This was a leadership moment that could influence her own career trajectory. Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez acted on reasonable security concerns, but he failed to properly verify the situation before taking action. Jessica replied carefully. As the senior Navy officer present, I should have been more attentive to the developing situation and intervened earlier to prevent the confrontation from escalating. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a fair assessment, Commander. Now, what would you recommend as the appropriate response to this situation? The question put Jessica in a difficult position. She needed to balance support for her Army counterpart with acknowledgement of his mistake, while also demonstrating leadership and judgment that would reflect well on her own capabilities. The fact that dozens of soldiers from both services were listening added pressure to give an answer that would maintain good order and discipline while addressing the incident appropriately. Ma'am, I recommend that we use this as a learning opportunity for all personnel present, Jessica said after a moment of consideration. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez made an honest mistake based on incomplete information. Rather than focusing on fault or punishment, we should emphasize the importance of verification procedures and maintaining respect for all personnel, regardless of their apparent status. Sarah smiled for the first time since revealing her identity. Excellent answer, Commander. That's exactly the kind of thinking this joint training program is designed to develop. Different services, different perspectives, but common commitment to learning from mistakes and improving performance. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized that his career might survive this incident after all. The Admiral's approach was far more constructive than he had any right to expect, given the severity of his error. He also began to understand that this situation was being used as an educational tool rather than simply a disciplinary matter. Now, then, Sarah continued, addressing the entire group of soldiers, I'd like everyone to take something valuable from this incident. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez learned about the importance of verification and avoiding assumptions. Commander Walsh demonstrated appropriate leadership in supporting a joint service partner while maintaining accountability. What should the rest of you learn? A young Navy SEAL raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, we should learn not to judge people by their appearance or civilian clothes. Someone could have important authority even if they don't look like what we expect. Sarah nodded approvingly. Good observation, petty officer. What else? An Army Ranger spoke up. Ma'am, we should learn to pay attention to our surroundings and the people around us. If we had been more aware, we might have recognized that the observer knew too much about military procedures to be just a regular civilian. Excellent point, Sarah replied. Situational awareness is crucial in both training and combat environments. You need to notice details that don't fit expected patterns, because those details often contain important information. Lieutenant Commander Walsh decided to contribute to the discussion. Ma'am, I think we should also learn about the importance of chain of command and proper communication. When there's uncertainty about authority or procedures, the appropriate response is to contact higher headquarters for clarification, not to make unilateral decisions that could create problems. Sarah was impressed by the quality of the discussion that was developing. Instead of focusing on embarrassment or blame, the soldiers were extracting meaningful lessons that would improve their performance in future situations. This was exactly the kind of learning environment that effective military training was supposed to create. Marcus found his voice again and decided to add his own insight to the conversation. Ma'am, I think we should also learn about treating everyone with respect and professionalism, regardless of who we think they are. Even if you had been a civilian contractor, I could have handled the situation more diplomatically. Outstanding observation, Staff Sergeant, Sarah replied. Military bearing and courtesy should be consistent, not dependent on the perceived rank or status of the person you're dealing with. A true professional maintains the same standards in all interactions. The educational discussion continued for several more minutes, with soldiers from both services contributing insights about communication, leadership, verification procedures, and professional conduct. Sarah was pleased to see how quickly the group had moved from shock and embarrassment to productive analysis and learning. As the formal discussion wound down, Sarah realized that she had stumbled into exactly the kind of situation that made unannounced inspections so valuable. The soldiers' natural reactions and recovery from the unexpected incident provided more insight into their character and training than any scripted exercise could have offered. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah announced, I want you to know that what I've observed here today has been extremely positive. The quality of your tactical performance during the exercise was excellent, and your response to this unexpected situation has been professional and thoughtful. This is exactly the kind of adaptability and learning mindset that makes joint operations successful. The visible relief on faces throughout the crowd was almost palpable. Soldiers who had been worried about negative consequences for themselves or their units began to realize that the incident might actually reflect positively on their professionalism and character. Marcus stepped forward, his posture now showing proper military bearing as he addressed Sarah directly. Ma'am, I want to formally apologize for my behavior, and thank you for turning this into a learning opportunity rather than a disciplinary matter. Your leadership in this situation has taught me more about professionalism than I could have learned from any classroom instruction. Sarah studied Marcus carefully, evaluating his sincerity and his understanding of what had transpired. She could see genuine remorse and recognition of his mistake, combined with appreciation for the constructive way the situation had been handled. This was the kind of growth and learning that made military training worthwhile. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your apology is accepted and appreciated, Sarah replied formally. More importantly, your willingness to learn from this experience and extract meaningful lessons demonstrates the kind of leadership potential that the Army needs from its non-commissioned officers. Don't let this mistake define you. Let your response to it demonstrate your character. Jessica Walsh watched this exchange with growing respect for Admiral Chen's leadership style. The way she had transformed a potentially career-ending incident into a positive learning experience showed exactly the kind of skill and wisdom that had earned her such a distinguished position at such a young age. The crowd of soldiers began to disperse as word spread that the immediate crisis had passed and been resolved constructively. However, many remained nearby, hoping to observe more of the Admiral's interaction with the training program. It wasn't often that personnel at their level had the opportunity to see such senior leadership in an informal, educational setting. Sarah turned her attention back to the training exercise that had been interrupted by the incident. "Commander Walsh, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd like to continue observing your joint training program. Please resume normal operations. I'm here to evaluate the program's effectiveness, not to disrupt your soldiers' learning." Both officers nodded and began organizing their respective units to continue with the scheduled training activities. However, the dynamic of the entire exercise had subtly changed. Soldiers who had been performing well now felt additional motivation to demonstrate their capabilities before such distinguished observation. The competitive tension between Army and Navy units remained, but it was now tempered by shared respect for the professionalism they had all demonstrated during the incident. As the training resumed, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her inspection had taken. What had begun as routine observation had become a masterclass in leadership, communication, and professional development. The lessons learned from this single incident would likely have more lasting impact than months of formal instruction. The afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky as the joint training exercise continued under Admiral Chen's watchful eye, but now everyone understood exactly who was watching and why her evaluation mattered so much. The afternoon training exercises took on a completely different atmosphere following the morning's incident. Word of Admiral Chen's presence had spread throughout the entire facility, carried by soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation or heard about it from others. Rather than the relaxed, routine training session that had been planned, every exercise now carried the weight of performance before one of the Navy's most senior special operations officers. Sarah noticed the change immediately. Soldiers moved with crisper precision, communications became more formal and professional, and the competitive edge between Army and Navy units intensified significantly. While she appreciated the improved attention to detail, she also recognized that this heightened performance might not represent the program's normal operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Walsh approached Sarah during a break between exercises, her expression showing both respect and professional curiosity. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what brought you to observe our training program today? We weren't notified about any formal inspection or evaluation." Sarah smiled at the direct question, appreciating Jessica's willingness to seek information rather than simply accept uncertainty. "Commander, this joint training program was developed based on recommendations I made following analysis of recent joint operations. I wanted to see how the program was functioning without the artificial atmosphere that formal inspections often create." The irony of the statement was not lost on either woman. The morning's incident had created exactly the kind of artificial atmosphere that Sarah had hoped to avoid, though in a completely unexpected way. Instead of soldiers performing carefully rehearsed demonstrations for visiting officials, they were now trying to prove themselves worthy of their profession following an embarrassing mistake. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "Ma'am, I have to admit that your assessment this morning has already changed how I'm thinking about leadership and communication. Watching you turn a potentially devastating situation into a learning opportunity was masterful. Is that something you learned through experience, or is it part of formal leadership training?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Commander, effective leadership under pressure comes primarily from experience, but it's built on a foundation of formal training and education. The key is learning to see every unexpected situation as an opportunity rather than just a problem to be solved." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been organizing equipment for the next exercise, but he had positioned himself close enough to overhear the conversation between the two Navy officers. The morning's incident had left him deeply thoughtful about his own leadership style and decision-making processes. He was discovering that embarrassment could be a powerful teacher when combined with constructive guidance. The next exercise on the training schedule involved a complex scenario requiring coordination between ground forces and simulated air support. The Army Rangers would establish a landing zone, while Navy SEALs provided security and target identification for incoming aircraft. Success required precise timing, clear communication, and absolute trust between the different units. Sarah positioned herself at the Exercise Control Center, where she could observe both the planning process and the execution phase. She was particularly interested in seeing how the morning's lessons about communication and verification would influence the soldiers' approach to this more complex challenge. Marcus and Jessica huddled over maps and communication equipment, developing their coordination plan. Sarah noticed that their interaction was markedly different from what she had observed earlier. Both officers were asking more questions, confirming details more thoroughly, and checking their understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations. SEAL Team will need 3 minutes to establish overwatch positions before we signal aircraft approach, Jessica explained, pointing to elevated positions marked on the tactical map. Can your Rangers provide security for the landing zone during that window? Marcus studied the terrain carefully before responding. Roger that, Commander. My team can establish a defensive perimeter, but we'll need continuous communication about your positions to avoid any coordination problems. What frequencies will you be monitoring? The level of detail in their planning discussion was significantly higher than Sarah had observed in the morning exercises. Both officers were clearly applying the lessons about verification and communication that had emerged from the earlier incident. This was exactly the kind of adaptive learning that distinguished truly professional military units. The exercise began with both teams moving to their assigned positions. Sarah watched through binoculars as Rangers established security around the designated landing zone, while SEALs moved toward elevated positions that would provide observation and fire support. The coordination appeared smooth and professional, with regular radio communications confirming positions and status. However, Sarah's experienced, I caught subtle signs of the underlying tension that still existed between the units. Rangers moved with characteristic speed and aggression, while SEALs maintained their methodical, precision-focused approach. These different operational styles were not inherently problematic, but they required careful management to prevent misunderstandings. The simulated aircraft approach began exactly on schedule, with exercise controllers playing the role of helicopter pilots requesting landing zone status and threat assessment. Lieutenant Commander Walsh's SEAL team provided detailed intelligence about potential enemy positions, while Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's Rangers confirmed that the landing zone was secure and properly marked. Everything was proceeding perfectly until the exercise scenario introduced an unexpected complication. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy reinforcements were approaching the area, potentially compromising the safety of the landing operation. The ground teams would need to adapt their plan quickly while maintaining security for the incoming aircraft. Sarah leaned forward with interest as she watched both teams respond to the changing situation. This was exactly the kind of adaptive challenge that separated competent units from truly excellent ones. The ability to maintain coordination while adjusting to unexpected developments was a critical skill in real combat operations. Marcus immediately began repositioning his Rangers to establish a wider defensive perimeter that could handle threats from multiple directions. Meanwhile, Jessica adjusted her SEALs' positions to provide better observation coverage of the approaches identified in the new intelligence report. Both actions made tactical sense, but they needed to be coordinated to avoid gaps in coverage. Ranger 6, this is SEAL 6. Jessica's voice crackled over the radio. We're adjusting positions to cover eastern approaches. Can you extend your perimeter to maintain security on the western side? SEAL 6, Ranger 6 copies. Marcus responded promptly. We can adjust westward, but that will reduce our strength at the primary landing zone. Are you confident your overwatch can cover potential threats from elevated positions? Sarah smiled as she listened to the professional coordination between the two teams. The morning's lessons about communication and verification were clearly being applied under pressure. Both officers were asking the right questions and confirming their understanding before making commitments that would affect the entire operation. The exercise continued with increasing complexity as additional complications were introduced by the controllers. Simulated equipment failures, communication problems, and changing weather conditions all tested the team's ability to maintain coordination while adapting to unexpected challenges. Sarah was impressed by the professional competence displayed by both units. As the exercise reached its climax, with the simulated aircraft successfully landing and departing despite multiple complications, Sarah reflected on the transformation she had observed throughout the day. The morning's incident had clearly accelerated the learning process for everyone involved, creating insights that might have taken weeks to develop under normal circumstances. The after-action review process provided Sarah with additional insights into the soldiers' professional development. Both teams conducted thorough analysis of their performance, identifying both successful actions and areas for improvement. The discussion was candid and constructive, with soldiers from both services contributing observations and suggestions. Marcus stood before the assembled soldiers, his bearing now showing the confidence of someone who had learned important lessons and successfully applied them. Today's exercises demonstrated excellent coordination between our units, but they also highlighted areas where we can improve our communication and planning processes. Jessica nodded in agreement. The key lesson I'm taking from today is that verification and confirmation are not signs of weakness or lack of trust. They're professional tools that help us maintain coordination under pressure. We should be asking more questions, not fewer. Sarah was particularly impressed by the quality of insights being shared by junior personnel. Young soldiers from both services were contributing observations about leadership, communication, and teamwork that demonstrated real understanding of the principles involved. This kind of learning environment was exactly what effective military training was supposed to create. A young Army specialist raised his hand during the discussion. Sergeant Rodriguez, I noticed that our coordination improved significantly when we started confirming details instead of just assuming the other team understood our intentions. Should we be doing that in all joint operations? Marcus smiled at the question, recognizing that his soldiers were extracting meaningful lessons from their experiences. Absolutely, specialist. Clear communication and verification should be standard procedure in any joint operation, regardless of how simple or routine it might seem. A Navy petty officer added his own observation. Commander Walsh, it seems like the different operational styles between Rangers and SEALs actually complement each other when we coordinate properly. The Rangers' speed helps us maintain momentum, while our methodical approach helps ensure we don't miss important details. Jessica nodded approvingly. That's an excellent observation, petty officer. Different units bring different strengths to joint operations. The key is learning how to combine those strengths effectively rather than trying to make everyone operate the same way. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the quality of analysis and learning that was taking place. The soldiers were not just reviewing what had happened during the exercises. They were extracting principles that would improve their performance in future operations. This was exactly the kind of professional development that distinguished elite military units. As the formal after-action review concluded, Sarah decided it was time to provide her own observations about the training program. The soldiers had demonstrated their ability to learn from mistakes, adapt to unexpected challenges, and maintain professional coordination under pressure. These were exactly the qualities that successful joint operations required. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, addressing the entire assembled group, I want to share some observations about what I've witnessed today. First, your tactical competence during the exercises has been excellent. Both Army and Navy units demonstrated the kind of professional skills that our military needs to maintain its effectiveness. The soldiers listened with obvious attention, understanding that they were receiving feedback from someone with extensive experience in special operations and joint military planning. This was the kind of insight that could influence their careers and their effectiveness as military professionals. Second, Sarah continued, Your response to unexpected challenges has been outstanding. Military operations rarely go according to plan, and your ability to adapt while maintaining coordination is exactly what makes joint operations successful. You've shown that different operational styles can complement each other when properly coordinated. Marcus and Jessica exchanged glances, both recognizing that Admiral Chin's assessment was exceeding their expectations. What had begun as a potentially disastrous day was turning into a positive evaluation that could enhance the reputation of the joint training program. Finally, Sarah concluded, your willingness to learn from mistakes and extract meaningful lessons demonstrates the kind of professional maturity that our military needs from its personnel. The incident this morning could have become a source of embarrassment and division. Instead, you turned it into an opportunity for growth and improved understanding. The mood among the assembled soldiers was noticeably positive as they realized that their day's work was being recognized and appreciated by senior leadership. More importantly, they understood that they had genuinely learned valuable lessons that would make them more effective in future operations. As the formal portion of the training day concluded, Sarah prepared to continue her evaluation with individual discussions with key personnel. The morning's incident had provided unexpected insights, but she still needed to gather detailed information about the program's strengths, weaknesses, and potential for expansion to other military facilities. As the formal training exercises concluded, Sarah requested individual meetings with the senior personnel involved in the joint training program. She wanted to gather detailed feedback about the program's effectiveness and identify areas for potential improvement or expansion. The conference room in the facility's administrative building provided a quiet space for these discussions away from the training areas. Lieutenant Commander Walsh was the first to meet with Admiral Chun. Jessica entered the room with obvious nervousness, despite her successful performance throughout the day. Meeting one-on-one with such a senior officer was an opportunity that few junior commanders ever experienced, and she wanted to make the most of it. Sarah gestured for Jessica to take a seat across from her at the conference table. Commander, please relax. This is an informal discussion, not an evaluation board. I'm interested in your honest assessment of this joint training program, both its strengths and its challenges. Jessica took a deep breath and composed her thoughts. Ma'am, I believe the program has tremendous potential, but it's also revealed some significant cultural differences between services that we're still learning to navigate. Army units tend to emphasize speed and overwhelming force, while Navy SEALs focus on precision and methodical execution. Both approaches have merit, but combining them requires constant communication and compromise. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of insight I was hoping to hear. Have you identified specific strategies that help bridge those cultural differences? Yes, ma'am, Jessica replied, gaining confidence. We've learned that joint planning sessions need to be longer and more detailed than single service operations. We can't assume that other units will interpret instructions the same way we do. We also need to establish clear communication protocols that work for all participating services. Sarah made notes as Jessica spoke, impressed by the thoughtful analysis. What about training scenarios? Have you found that certain types of exercises work better for joint operations than others? Jessica considered the question carefully. Ma'am, complex scenarios that require different types of expertise seem to work best. When each service can contribute their unique capabilities toward a common goal, the coordination improves naturally. Simple scenarios where units are just working side by side don't provide enough motivation for real integration. The discussion continued for 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from equipment compatibility to command structure challenges. Sarah was pleased to discover that Jessica had given serious thought to the program's broader implications and had developed practical insights that could be applied at other facilities. When Jessica's meeting concluded, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez entered for his session with Admiral Chun. Marcus was visibly nervous, still affected by the morning's incident despite the positive resolution. He understood that this meeting could influence his career trajectory significantly. Sarah immediately noticed his tension and decided to address it directly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, This morning's incident is behind us. I'm not here to relitigate that situation. I'm here to get your professional assessment of this training program. Your experience and observations are valuable, regardless of what happened earlier. Marcus felt some of his tension ease as he realized that Admiral Chun was genuinely interested in his professional opinion rather than dwelling on his mistake. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. This joint training program has been challenging, but extremely educational. Working with Navy SEALs has forced us to examine our own procedures and assumptions in ways that single-service training never did. Sarah leaned forward with interest. Can you give me specific examples of how your procedures have changed? Marcus nodded eagerly. Ma'am, we've learned to spend much more time on pre-mission planning and coordination. Army Rangers are used to rapid decision-making and quick adaptation, but joint operations require more deliberate communication. We've had to slow down our initial planning process to speed up our execution phase. That's a sophisticated understanding of the trade-offs involved, Sarah observed. Have you seen improvements in your Rangers' overall performance as a result of this training? Absolutely, ma'am, Marcus replied with conviction. My soldiers are asking better questions, paying closer attention to details, and showing more awareness of how their actions affect other units. They're becoming better soldiers overall, not just better joint operation participants. Sarah was impressed by Marcus's ability to see beyond the immediate challenges to identify long-term benefits. What recommendations would you make for expanding this program to other facilities? Marcus thought carefully before responding. Ma'am, I think the key is starting with realistic expectations. Units need time to learn each other's capabilities and limitations before attempting complex operations. I'd recommend beginning with simple coordination exercises and gradually increasing complexity as trust and understanding develop. The conversation covered additional topics, including resource requirements, instructor training, and potential applications to other military specialties. Sarah found Marcus's insights valuable and was pleased to see how much he had learned from his participation in the program. The final individual meeting was with the facility's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Morrison. Colonel Morrison had been observing the day's events from a distance, aware that Admiral Chun was conducting an informal inspection, but uncertain about the specific focus or potential outcomes. Colonel Morrison entered the conference room with the confident bearing of a senior officer accustomed to dealing with high-ranking visitors. However, she was also curious about Admiral Chin's assessment of the Joint Training Program and its implications for her facility. Admiral Chun, Colonel Morrison began, I want to thank you for the way you handled this morning's incident. Your leadership in turning a potentially negative situation into a learning opportunity was exemplary and reflected well on all the services involved. Sarah appreciated the comment, but was more interested in discussing the broader program. Colonel Morrison, I'm here because this joint training program represents a significant innovation in inter-service cooperation. What's your assessment of its effectiveness and sustainability? Colonel Morrison had clearly given this question considerable thought. Ma'am, the program has exceeded my expectations in terms of improving coordination and communication between services. However, it requires significantly more resources than single-service training, both in terms of instructor time and facility usage. We need to demonstrate clear benefits to justify the additional investment. Sarah nodded, recognizing the practical considerations that facility commanders faced. What specific benefits have you observed that would justify those additional resources? The quality of joint planning has improved dramatically, Colonel Morrison replied promptly. Units that complete this training demonstrate much better coordination during subsequent joint exercises. We've also seen improvements in overall professionalism and attention to detail that carry over into single-service operations. The discussion expanded to cover administrative challenges, funding requirements, and potential modifications to the training curriculum. Colonel Morrison provided valuable insights about the practical aspects of implementing joint training programs at the facility level. As the individual meetings concluded, Sarah realized that she had gathered far more useful information than she had expected when she arrived that morning. The unplanned incident had provided insights into leadership, adaptability, and professional development that would have been impossible to observe during a routine inspection. Sarah decided to conclude her visit with a final group meeting involving all the senior personnel. This would allow her to share her overall assessment of the program and provide guidance for future development. The conference room was arranged with chairs in a circle to facilitate open discussion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began as everyone settled into their seats, "today has been extremely valuable for my assessment of this joint training program. I want to share my conclusions and get your thoughts about next steps." The assembled officers listened attentively, understanding that Admiral Chin's assessment would likely influence the future of joint training programs throughout the military. "First," Sarah continued, "the tactical competence I've observed today has been outstanding. Both Army and Navy units demonstrated the kind of professional skills that make joint operations successful. The level of coordination and communication you've achieved is exactly what we need to replicate at other facilities." Colonel Morrison felt a sense of satisfaction at the positive assessment. The joint training program had been a significant undertaking for her facility, and recognition from such a senior officer validated the effort and resources that had been invested. "Second," Sarah added, "your response to unexpected challenges has demonstrated the kind of adaptability that distinguishes truly professional military units. The way you handled this morning's incident and applied lessons learned to subsequent exercises shows exactly the kind of learning mindset that our military needs." Marcus felt a profound sense of relief and pride at this assessment. What had begun as the worst mistake of his military career had somehow become part of a positive evaluation of his unit's professionalism and adaptability. "Finally," Sarah concluded, "I believe this program is ready for expansion to additional facilities. However, that expansion needs to be carefully managed to ensure that the quality and effectiveness we've achieved here can be replicated elsewhere." Lieutenant Commander Walsh felt excitement at the prospect of the program's expansion. She had invested significant effort in developing the coordination protocols and training methods that made joint operations successful, and seeing those efforts recognized at the highest levels of military leadership was extremely gratifying. Sarah opened the discussion to questions and comment from the assembled officers. The conversation that followed was candid and constructive, with everyone contributing insights about implementation challenges, resource requirements, and potential improvements to the training curriculum. "Admiral," Colonel Morrison asked, "what timeline are you envisioning for expansion of this program? We'd be happy to provide assistance and guidance to other facilities that want to implement similar training." Sarah considered the question carefully. "Colonel, I think we need to move deliberately but not slowly. I'd like to see pilot programs established at 3 additional facilities within the next 6 months. Your facility would serve as the model and provide training support for the new locations." The prospect of their work serving as a model for other facilities was exciting for everyone involved. It meant that their efforts would have impact far beyond their own base and would influence how the entire military approached joint training and operations. "Commander Walsh, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah continued, "I'd like you both to be involved in developing the training protocols and instructor guidance for the expanded program. Your experience with the practical challenges of joint operations would be invaluable for other units." Both officers expressed enthusiasm for participating in the program's expansion. The opportunity to influence military training at national level was exactly the kind of career development that ambitious professional soldiers sought. As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her routine inspection had taken. What had begun as a simple observation of training exercises had become a comprehensive evaluation of leadership, adaptability, and professional development. The lessons learned would influence not just this facility, but the entire approach to joint military training. The afternoon sun was setting as Admiral Chun prepared to depart Fort Bragg, carrying with her a wealth of information and insights that would shape the future of inter-service cooperation and training. The day that had begun with a case of mistaken identity had evolved into a masterclass in military professionalism and leadership development. 3 months after Admiral Chin's unexpected visit to Fort Bragg, the ripple effects of that day continued to influence military training programs across multiple facilities. The Joint Training Program had not only survived her evaluation, but had become a model for inter-service cooperation that was being studied and replicated throughout the Department of Defense. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez stood in the briefing room at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, addressing a group of Army Rangers and Navy SEALs who were about to begin their own joint training program. The confidence in his voice and bearing reflected the profound changes he had experienced since his encounter with Admiral Chen. That moment of mistaken identity had become a defining experience that shaped his approach to leadership and professional development. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, joint operations require more than just putting different units in the same area and hoping for the best. They require deliberate coordination, clear communication, and mutual respect for the capabilities that each service brings to the mission. The soldiers listening to his briefing represented the third facility to implement the expanded Joint Training Program. Word of the Fort Bragg program's success had spread throughout the special operations community, creating demand for similar training opportunities at other installations. Marcus had become one of the program's primary instructors, traveling between facilities to share lessons learned and help establish new training protocols. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh was conducting a parallel session in another building, working with Navy personnel who would be participating in the joint exercises. Her role had expanded significantly following Admiral Chen's visit, and she now served as the Navy's liaison for Joint Training Program development. The experience had accelerated her career progression and established her as an expert in inter-service cooperation. The key to successful joint operations, Jessica explained to her audience, is understanding that different services approach problems differently, and those differences are strengths rather than obstacles. Army Rangers excel at rapid, decisive action, while Navy SEALs bring precision and methodical planning. When we combine those approaches effectively, we create capabilities that exceed what any single service can achieve alone. The training program that emerged from Admiral Chen's evaluation had become more sophisticated and comprehensive than the original Fort Bragg experiment. Lessons learned from multiple implementations have been incorporated into standardized curricula that could be adapted to different facilities and unit types. The success rate of joint operations involving units trained in these programs had improved measurably, validating the investment in expanded training. Admiral Chen herself had been promoted to a position overseeing special operations training throughout the Navy, partly based on the success of the Joint Training Initiative. Her experience at Fort Bragg had demonstrated not only the effectiveness of unannounced inspections, but also the value of turning unexpected situations into learning opportunities. The incident with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had become a case study taught in senior leadership courses. Back at Fort Bragg, Colonel Patricia Morrison was hosting a group of visiting officials who wanted to observe the original Joint Training Program in action. The facility had become a destination for military leaders interested in improving inter-service cooperation, and Morrison took pride in showcasing the innovations that had emerged from that memorable day with Admiral Chen. The current training exercise involved units from 3 different services working together to complete a complex urban warfare scenario. Army Rangers provided assault capabilities. Navy SEALs offered precision targeting and intelligence gathering, and Air Force Special Operations personnel coordinated close air support. The level of coordination and communication displayed was remarkably advanced compared to what Morrison had observed just months earlier. Watching from the observation area where Admiral Chen had stood during her visit, Morrison reflected on how dramatically the program had evolved. The incident that could have ended careers had instead catalyzed improvements that enhanced military readiness and effectiveness. The conference room, where those crucial individual meetings had taken place, now displayed a plaque commemorating the program's designation as a model for joint training excellence. Marcus had returned to Fort Bragg between his instructor assignments, and he often found himself thinking about the lessons he had learned from his encounter with Admiral Chun. The embarrassment and fear he had felt that day had been transformed into motivation for professional growth and improved leadership. His reputation within the Army had actually been enhanced by his willingness to learn from mistakes and apply those lessons to help other soldiers. During a quiet moment between training sessions, Marcus visited the spot where he had confronted the unassuming woman who turned out to be a Navy admiral. The memory still made him shake his head in amazement, but it no longer carried the sting of embarrassment it once had. Instead, it served as a reminder of the importance of keeping an open mind and never making assumptions based on appearances. The story of Admiral Chin's visit had become something of a legend within the special operations community. Different versions circulated through various units, some more embellished than others, but all carrying the same core message about the importance of professional respect, thorough verification, and learning from mistakes. New soldiers arriving at facilities with joint training programs often heard the story during their initial briefings. Jessica Walsh had compiled a comprehensive report on the joint training program's effectiveness, documenting measurable improvements in coordination, communication, and mission success rates. The data supported expansion of the program to additional facilities and integration with other military training initiatives. Her work had caught the attention of senior Navy leadership, opening opportunities for advancement and increased responsibility. The conference room, where Admiral Chun had conducted her individual interviews, had been converted into a dedicated space for after-action reviews and professional development discussions. A portrait of Admiral Chun hung on one wall, not in recognition of her rank alone, but as a reminder of the leadership principles she had demonstrated during her visit. The inscription below the portrait read, "Leadership is turning every challenge into an opportunity for growth." Admiral Chun occasionally received updates about the program's continued success and expansion. She took particular satisfaction in learning about the career progression of the personnel who had been involved in that memorable day. Marcus Rodriguez had been promoted and was being considered for advancement to senior non-commissioned officer positions. Jessica Walsh had received excellent fitness reports and was on track for early promotion to commander. The broader impact of the joint training program extended beyond the specific units that participated in the exercises. Officers and enlisted personnel who completed the training carried improved coordination skills and inter-service understanding to their subsequent assignments. This created a multiplier effect that enhanced joint operations throughout the military, even in units that had never formally participated in the training program. 6 months after the original incident, Admiral Chun made an announced visit to Fort Bragg to conduct a formal evaluation of the program's continued development. The difference between this visit and her previous unscheduled observation was striking. Soldiers moved with precision and confidence. Coordination between services appeared seamless, and the overall atmosphere reflected professional competence and mutual respect. Marcus and Jessica, now recognized as subject matter experts in joint training operations, briefed Admiral Chun on the program's evolution and expansion. The presentation demonstrated not only their professional growth, but also their deep understanding of the principles that made joint operations successful. Admiral Chun was impressed by their development and their contribution to improving military readiness. During her formal remarks to the assembled personnel, Admiral Chun reflected on the lessons learned from her initial visit. 6 months ago, an unexpected incident at this facility taught us all valuable lessons about leadership, communication, and professional growth. Today, I see a program that has matured into a model for the entire military. Your commitment to learning from challenges and turning obstacles into opportunities has created something truly exceptional. The audience of soldiers, many of whom had heard various versions of the story about Admiral Chin's first visit, listened with obvious pride and attention. They understood that they were part of something significant that would influence military training and operations for years to come. The success of this program, Admiral Chun continued, demonstrates that our military's greatest strength lies not in our equipment or our numbers, but in our people and their willingness to learn, adapt, and grow. The lesson that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez learned about avoiding assumptions and verifying information has become a principle that guides everything we do here. Marcus, now wearing the stripes of Sergeant First Class, felt a profound sense of accomplishment as he listened to Admiral Chen's remarks. The worst mistake of his military career had somehow become the foundation for one of the most successful initiatives he had ever been involved with. The transformation still amazed him, and it reinforced his belief in the power of learning from failure. As Admiral Chun concluded her visit, she took a moment to walk through the training areas where the original incident had occurred. The spot where Marcus had confronted her was now marked with a small plaque reading Leadership Learning Point. It served as a reminder to all personnel that every situation, no matter how challenging or embarrassing, contained opportunities for growth and improvement. The Joint Training Program continued to expand and evolve, reaching additional facilities and incorporating new technologies and methodologies. The principles established during those crucial hours at Fort Bragg became the foundation for a transformation in how the military approached inter-service cooperation and professional development. Years later, military historians would identify Admiral Chen's unscheduled visit to Fort Bragg as a turning point in joint operations training. The incident that began with mistaken identity and could have ended in career damage instead became the catalyst for systemic improvements that enhanced military readiness and effectiveness. The story served as a powerful example of how leadership, properly applied, could transform challenges into opportunities and mistakes into valuable learning experiences. The legacy of that day lived on in every soldier who completed joint training programs based on the Fort Bragg model. Marcus Rodriguez's assumption about the casually dressed observer had been wrong in every possible way, but Admiral Chen's response to his mistake had been so right that it created lasting positive change throughout the military. Sometimes being in the wrong spot at the wrong time could lead to exactly the right outcome for everyone involved. The simple act of a senior officer choosing education over punishment, growth over discipline, and understanding over anger had rippled through the military in ways that no formal training program could have achieved. It demonstrated that true leadership was not about asserting authority, but about creating opportunities for others to learn, grow, and become better versions of themselves. Admiral Chen's visit to Fort Bragg had proven that sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected sources.